I believe the pre-buy is the most critical component. We've determined that your needs. We've found what we think is the best aircraft out there within the make and model. And now the pre-buy is the survey. It's the deep dive into this particular aircraft that you're going to purchase to ensure everything is as represented. And the mechanical condition is the value of the aircraft.
Well, Mike, I'd like to say the hard part's over, but really it's probably just beginning, because found the plane or potentially a couple planes that might fit the bill, the pre-buy is an important, it's probably not the most important aspect of this. Would you agree?
Yeah, I believe the pre-buy is the most critical component. We've determined that your needs. We've found what we think is the best aircraft out there within the make and model. And now the pre-buy is the survey. It's the deep dive into this particular aircraft that you're going to purchase to ensure everything is as represented. And the mechanical condition is the value of the aircraft.
And when you're dealing with a broker too, obviously you're waiting for the pre-buy to really get the full, do the assessment and what the value of this plane is.
The broker, as you mentioned, the broker should be deeply involved at this point. He has identified the candidate maintenance facilities that are qualified or most reputable in this make and model aircraft. He's gotten a cost estimate, so you know what it's going to cost. He's probably at the point where we've negotiated with the seller in the pre-purchase, the purchase agreement. He's determined who's going to pay for what as a result of this pre-purchase inspection. So right now, this is where the broker earns his pay as far as I'm concerned.
Gotcha. So finding a reputable maintenance entity, whether that's got to be a challenge, but having a broker helps out with that. Is there any pro tips you have, again, for someone who maybe doesn't, I wouldn't say necessarily qualify for a broker, or they're just going to go on their own? How would you navigate that space?
So the pro tip I would offer, and one of the things I try to encourage as an incentive to a seller, is when you're doing a survey, especially on the larger aircraft, not as critical with the smaller single engine aircraft, but with the larger aircraft, these aircraft will fly halfway across the country just to have a survey done. And there's an expense involved in that, there's an exposure involved in that. So one of the things I like to suggest is let's find a reputable repair shop that's as close to the aircraft's home base as practical, but not using the owner's existing maintenance shop. So if the owner's had a particular shop he's been using for the last 10 years on the aircraft, that's not the optimal shop for us to look or to use to get an objective opinion on it.
Absolutely.
So finding another shop that's close to him is a benefit to all parties.
You mentioned, obviously at this point, the broker has probably had a discussion, you've already had a discussion with the owner of who's going to cover what costs. Now, does that include, and should you be talking about who's going to pay to fly the plane out there, or who's going to be responsible if we think there might be this problem or that? Like, where does that fall into the deal?
One of the topics I believe we're going to discuss later is the actual purchase and sale agreement. And so these are components that are involved in the letter of intent that's drafted, or the purchase and sale agreement, of which party is going to be responsible for the cost of repositioning the aircraft, whose crew will be flying the aircraft. When the aircraft goes in for an inspection, it's customary for the buyer to pay the cost for that inspection. Usually they'll pay the flat rate labor to the maintenance provider. Often what gets negotiated is any unairworthy discrepancies discovered during that inspection often fall on the seller's expense.
Okay.
Where the gray area is when you get items that are questionable. Brakes and tires are often a big thing, where are they beyond limits or are they just close to the limit? And so we're going to rely heavily on the repair station to make those determinations, because that's obviously going to determine who pays any cost to remedy that.
You know, I often joke the fighter pilot standard answer is, it depends. And so I imagine, again, this applies when it comes to it. But do you have any advice when it comes to negotiating or managing expectations in the process when it's like, hey, you're going to pay for this or that, etc.
You just said my favorite word of aircraft sales. Everything that I try to do as a broker, and I think most of my broker colleagues would also believe in, is managing expectations. Because if we don't manage our clients' expectations and the expectations of the maintenance shop and the expectations of the seller, then we run the risk of having a disappointed party. And you don't want to be the party that's disappointed.
Yeah, and when you're talking about such big purchases, and again, it doesn't matter if it's a single engine prop to again a business jet that can fly across the ocean. These are still big purchases, and that communication piece and managing expectations, I think, is huge. So Mike, now I think it's a good time to get into kind of the nuts and bolts of the pre-buy inspection. Can you walk me through from the beginning? And again, what does that look like? How do we get started, really?
So the pre-buy is really the survey, and it comes down to, what do you want to look at with the aircraft? As the aircraft gets more sophisticated, the depth of penetration of a survey gets more sophisticated. So if it's a single engine piston like a Cessna, that may involve a compression check and an oil analysis and pulling a couple of panels and a day's labor to kind of look everything over. If it's a more sophisticated aircraft, like a Pilatus or a Challenger or one of these aircraft in the shop, they could be down for a month getting very deeply inspected. What I like to suggest to people, in some places have what they call a pre-purchase survey. I'm not a fan of that term.
Okay.
And the reason is that term is the shop's way of saying, these are the things we like to look at for that aircraft make and model. But when they finished, you don't get a logbook entry that starts the meter over again. So I like, on a more sophisticated aircraft or even a simple aircraft, to do an annual type inspection as a survey. It gets a very detailed, in-depth, quantifiable look at all the systems on the aircraft. And when it's done, you get a logbook entry starting the Hobbs meter over again for the next year.
So I guess the ways to kind of pair those two together, an annual or certain phase inspections that might occur depending on the aircraft you're looking at, to maybe save a little bit of money?
It's a cost savings, and again, it's a investment in the next year, because once a year we got to look at these aircraft whether we fly them or not. So if we can look at them now with a fresh logbook entry, zeroing, it's a fresh annual, fresh 100-hour, fresh phase inspection, with the cost being shared by the selling party, then that's a benefit to us.
Again, I imagine a broker, that's someone who can help you navigate if we're going to do a cost sharing, because again, you mentioned that typically the onus for this inspection is falling on the purchaser. But when there's something that might align well, navigating those, is that something that usually you have to, is it a hurdle or is it a barrier that you're usually having to go back and forth on, or is it pretty easy?
It's often part of the negotiation process. If somebody's asking top dollar for their aircraft, the trade-off often of that is, okay, I want to do a very thorough survey on the aircraft. And what I'm going to do is if it's as nice and pristine as the seller is demanding through his price, then I want him to stand behind that and say, anything that we find on the aircraft as a result of that survey should fall on his side of the ledger. The pre-purchase inspection offers a whole host of potential benefits, and it's so important, and it's often neglected, especially when two friends perform a transaction on an aircraft. Little things. Maintenance goes in and looks for the mechanical airworthiness of the aircraft. One of the things a pre-purchase should do is look for more than that. We've had instances on a King Air very recently where the selling broker stated in the specifications that a particular component was installed in the aircraft. Maintenance shops don't look at that part of the transaction. The broker will be looking at that, and he, when it goes into maintenance, will confirm all of the specifications are there. It turns out, the day before closing, we found out that a $40,000 satellite weather receiver was not installed. The seller didn't know, the buyer didn't know, but that would have fallen on the buyer's nickel, and it was a very important component to them.
That's a huge hit when you're not expecting that. And again, like you said, maintenance, They're worried about airworthiness. Was this inspection done? Was this part changed out correctly? Does it meet all those? But again, they're probably not worried about certain components and whether or not they're installed or not.
Maintenance, they're going to go in our case, when we do our pre-purchase inspection, the maintenance shop is going to go in and confirm the continued airworthiness of the airplane. And that's a snapshot as of today. They're not going to spend a tremendous amount of time looking at the historical data associated with the aircraft. They're going to ensure that ADs, airworthiness directives, are accomplished. They're going to ensure that mandatory service bulletins are complied with. They're going to ensure that any calendar and hourly inspections are complied with as of this time. What we want to be sure they do is forecast out at a future date. I like to use 90 days and 60 hours of what's coming due in the near future, because while it's down and taken apart, may be an opportune time to knock out some future things that are coming due at minimal expense.
Do you see airworthiness directives? Is that something that often pops up? Because those can be pretty costly depending upon what that AD was out there for. Does that usually show itself in these type of pre-purchase inspections?
It does. And again, as you get more sophisticated in aircraft, you don't typically see ADs missed on Gulfstreams because they have one individual, and a flight department manager whose whole job it is to manage this aircraft on a day-to-day basis. But you and I as aircraft owners, that onus falls on us if we're the owner pilot. And all too often we see when it goes in, an AD that came out 20 years ago and everybody assumed was accomplished. On twin Cessnas, it happens to be an engine beam inspection. That's a huge inspection. The airplane's going to be down for months while they do this at significant cost. So if you can find that before the inspection, that's a critical one.
That's huge. It pays for it in itself. We were talking beforehand too, something that, again, when you're dealing with maintenance, let's talk, this wing is, part 1, 2, 3, and the wing gets replaced. Well, maintenance, when they do that inspection, I assume they're looking to make sure that it was the compliance to meet a wing changeout was done correctly and documented correctly. But having a broker and a pilot, there's going to be the question mark that pops up above your head is, well, why was this wing changed out?
That's a very good point. Maintenance is looking for what we call conformity. All the paperwork is right. So a part was replaced, it has the proper traceability of where that replacement part came from birth. What brokers and more seasoned professionals look at is, why was that part replaced? Often you take a wing of an aircraft and the logbook entry may be as simple as part number 123 removed, part number 123 reinstalled. Conformity and paperwork is all in order. The bigger question is why in the world would you have done that? And again, maintenance shops aren't asking those kinds of questions because they're not trained to think on resale value of the aircraft like a potential broker would be.
It's funny, again, I come from a different world, but every time I went to go fly an F-16, I'm reviewing the maintenance forms for that jet because you're flying a different jet potentially every single day. So you're figuring out what's going on with the plane. There's a whole nother language when it comes to technical orders in the Air Force and the parts that are getting changed out. So you have to kind of learn that. But I always found myself asking, well, why was this done? Did that plane did it wing get run into something? And we had instances where the tail of the aircraft got run into a hangar. And you would see that change out. It's like, well, what happened there? And it's just another piece that when you're going to go jump an F-16, all right, if something happens or acts a little squirrely, it's a clue bird that, all right, maybe there's something that's unresolved here, an issue. Slightly different, but there are some parallels when it comes to buying your own personal plane or buying it for a corporate flight department, et cetera.
If we're looking at logbooks, a very important factor is to see, are you seeing repetitive issues? Are you seeing, on an airplane like this that has air conditioning system, if you see it in the shop every month having the air conditioning system worked on, that should probably be a pretty good indicator that there's a good chance you're going to be in the shop every month working on your air conditioner as well. And all these become negotiating points with the seller. So the negotiation doesn't stop when the purchase agreement's signed. It often continues all the way to the very end of the transaction. And what you want to ensure is that you're being treated fairly and equitably when it comes to that negotiation.
Is there something that's happening beforehand? Let's say airworthiness directives, those are all published, that you should do research on or come into the negotiation process, even probably before the letter of intent, et cetera, that you're looking for to make sure, or hey, there were 10 ADs put out on this plane in particular, and I know these are very expensive things or they're minor things that you want to make sure you check. Is that happening beforehand? Would you recommend it? Or
Unless we are a qualified, licensed aircraft mechanic, we often can't physically dig into the airplane. We can't remove a panel
Right.
to verify if an AD was done. So that's what I like to leave to the professionals. I like them to confirm AD compliance and service bulletin compliance and inspection status. What I like to do prior to ever placing a letter of intent is confirm the specifications are the same as advertised. We know what we're buying. Do we like the physical look to the airplane? Do we see a beautiful airplane with crinkled skin that might indicate to us that there's been something that has transpired prior to that? So it's kind of getting that warm feeling. And you're looking through the logbooks more on a superficial, high level. Are there pages missing? Are there books missing? Does the previous maintenance inspection process look clean and methodical versus logbook entries that are just thrown into a box or a bag? All that kind of gives me and most buyers, I think, a general comfort feeling as to how that aircraft may have been maintained in the past.
are there any red flags or things that you might, it alerts you or kind of piques your ear when you're looking at a plane, whether it was based in a certain location, if it had multiple owners? Do any of those factors come into it or weigh into the decision-making process?
We just bought a personal aircraft very, very recently. We consummated here in the last 30 days. And to put it into perspective, I looked for 1 year, had a very good idea of what we were looking for. So having to have restraint and remove passion from it was challenging. So for 1 year we looked and we finally found the aircraft. And the fact that it had had one owner since new, it was low time, it was within the budget, it had been maintained by a very reputable repair station as opposed to just a licensed mechanic, all those things were so comforting. And when you went through the logs, they were meticulous, they were organized. To me, it was a no-brainer that this was the right find.
Okay, so sometimes you hear cars, if it's down by the beach all the time, corrosion and salt air. Again, things like that probably should play into the calculus, or at least be cognizant of as you step into one of these.
An aircraft, us living here in South Florida, we often see corrosion on aircraft versus an aircraft that perhaps lives in the Rockies or in a dry climate. The newer aircraft that are out right now do such a good job at corrosion preventative measures at manufacture that we're not seeing it as often as we do on the older aircraft. But that's a biggie, and once corrosion starts, in many cases, it's like cancer. You may treat it, but you never really kill it for good.
Yeah, it's funny. I do have F-16 stories of corrosion being a factor and it taking down planes for multiple years to do either big inspections or big overhauls. Not something you want to be. And maybe that's where it plays in my calculus, operating around salt air, that I think about that now, having been exposed to that in the military with the aircraft that I flew there.
It's a harsh environment and it's very unforgiving. So if these are things that, as we're identifying particular aircraft that we want, obviously if we're here at the pre-purchase, we've taken our large population of available aircraft and whittled it down to 2 or 3 that meet our short list. We don't ever want to take an aircraft into an inspection unless we're highly confident that this is going to be the one we want. Otherwise, we're just spending unnecessarily. So, assuming you've made it as far as the repair station, we're going to want to be looking very carefully. Once we even go into the repair station, we're going to look for the gotchas first. So we're going to ask the maintenance guys, look for corrosion, do compression checks, do turbine analysis, things that could break the deal very early, so that way you're not paying a big lump sum only to find out that you wasted money. We're going back to dipping our toe in the water as opposed to diving in too heavily.
That's what I call the showstoppers. So are there some showstoppers, a list of showstoppers that you would recommend looking at first, or does it depend on the plane?
we had talked about having a broker go look at an aircraft. In a case where an individual may not have utilized the services of a broker and they're doing their own due diligence, another interim step they may want to take is, rather than introduce the entire aircraft into the maintenance shop, just have them review the logbooks first, looking for any signs of damage history, missing records, corrosion, ongoing repetitive maintenance on a particular component or system. You may find that's either a showstopper for you, or again, it's a return to the negotiating table with the seller.
So you do that, do a maintenance, kind of logbook review is probably a good step to figure out, hey, do we actually want to take this to the next level and start pulling panels and doing the inspection? When it comes to doing that pre-buy inspection, let's say the plane, you've made it to that point, are there any kind of big ticket items that you want to hit on kind of right out the gate? Again, I'm assuming the maintenance professionals, they know what the showstoppers might be on these planes, and you're going to start with the big ticket items first. Is that a fair assumption?
It is. So let's assume that we've decided we're going to do an annual type inspection as our pre-purchase survey guideline. The maintenance shop doesn't care. The pre-purchase survey or the annual inspection survey tends to be a checklist about an inch or two thick, depending on the aircraft. But what we can do is say to them, we want you to check the engine first. Engines often are where the money's at. So if it's a turbine engine, it's very, very expensive. We'll want them to go in and look for those distresses in an engine first. Because if they're finding low compression in a piston on all the cylinders, we know that's going to be expensive. And we better have that conversation before we go any farther. Because if the seller says, I'm not going to pay for it, and the buyer may not want to pay for it, that may redirect your next step on if you're going to pursue that aircraft any further.
So a big piece of this, finding an objective maintenance facility to do the pre-buy inspections is important. Is there anything I should be concerned with when it comes to now getting the list of things that need to be fixed? Like, are there concerns with maybe that maintenance facility? Like, the way to make money is fixing airplanes, right? So are there things I should consider? Is there a worry that I should be there, that maybe this doesn't need to be fixed, or this is a minor item? Do I just have to kind of know that?
Again, this is where I believe in the value of professional representation, because often that broker has wherewithal or experience in what needs to be done and not done on that aircraft. A maintenance shop that's reputable doesn't go inspecting for dollars. They want to build a long-term reputation with that client. They're not looking to shear the sheep or skin the sheep, as they say. So finding a good, reputable maintenance shop that you trust and you want to build a relationship with, I think it's safe to know those guys are going to go in, they're going to do what needs to be done to ensure the aircraft is airworthy and safe, but not be over there inspecting for their own benefit.
Awesome. Mike, I think that's a good segue as we jump into the next lesson.